everybody. I show that it is 2 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. My name is Stacy Fox with the Cattle Raisers Association, and we're so happy to have you all here today as we continue with our weekly market updates, just to continue keeping you updated on what's going on, what's happened this week, kind of where we're looking, where we sit today, and appreciate all of you getting on. If you do have questions, we have quite a few people registered today, so we won't be able to open up the phone lines, but there is a question and answer box or a chat box, and you can put put your questions in either one of those, and our speaker will answer those at the end of the program. We are also recording this, and we will make it available to you tomorrow in an email that will go out from the system, so you will be able to hear this again if you'd like to go back to it. But just remember, TSCRA is continuing to work hard on your behalf during this time. We've got some other programs that we've been releasing. So next Wednesday at 2 p.m., we're actually going to have one of our School for Successful Ranching sessions that was going to be held at our convention that was unfortunately postponed. And so we're putting some of those online for you. Next week, we have landowner liability law with Tiffany Dow-Lashment with Texas A&M University. Many of you are aware of her. She's been to several TSCRA meetings and always does a phenomenal job. So be sure to go to our website to register for that one. That's next Wednesday at 2 p.m. And then we'll see you again here next Friday. But with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Anderson. Dr. David Anderson is a professor and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension economist in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M. He's the livestock and meat economist. His work involves the analysis of livestock market economics and policy. He is originally from Coolidge, Arizona, where his father is a cotton farmer. And Dr. Anderson did this for us a couple weeks ago and did a great job, and we're so glad to have you back. And so it's all yours.
Well, great. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be back with y'all, and I'm glad to be back. We certainly got plenty of stuff to talk about. I'm going to try to share my screen here and pull up a couple of slides just to really kind of just focus our comments on this week, and hopefully you guys can see that okay. Okay. Just making sure. Looks like give me a sign somehow if it's not. But I think you guys can see my screen. I thought I'd just kind of talk about what's going on this week, and I thought I would start with this with really, gosh, what's going on more at a retail side. Heck, we've got some reopening going on in the economy, really starting today. And I'm thinking more about restaurants. I think one of the key things that's going to go on in terms of everything through, the whole beef side is, how well does this go? What is the speed of reopening? How many restaurants do open? How many other folks go in there to eat? I think is a pretty darn good question and a real unknown. With that also, we've got packing plants with the president's executive order Tuesday afternoon to declare packing plants essential, that they need to be open or have to be open. How does that work too? In fact, what do we start seeing some demonstrable evidence of reopening and kind of loosening the chokehold, the backlog, log jam, whatever term we want to use for the whole packing side of the industry as well. So we've got some of that going on, and restaurants reopening. I think it's it's something worth thinking about, that we're doing this reopening. Restaurants are jumping in, trying to figure out what they're going to do, trying to order meat as part of their menu into these record high wholesale meat prices. And really into this really tight supply situation we've got, they're trying to jump in and start buying. And so I've turned it with some other groups, really a double whammy on the restaurants with everything they've struggled with, trying to get reopened and buy some meat to as part of their menus. I think it's interesting too. My wife once upon a time worked in restaurants a lot. She said when she saw this, she said, you know, 25, you get to use 25% of your tables, but you have 100% plus of your costs. How exactly is that going to work? How many restaurants are going to bite on that and try to make that work and try to make that happen? I think one of the things we'll see too is a lot of changes as we go forward with that. I think you may have seen in some of the rules that have come out, barbecue restaurants aren't supposed to have barbecue sauce at the tables anymore. Some of the condiments will have to be repackaged and given to you up there, not rather than serve yourself. So a lot of changes like that, it looks like are going to be happening at restaurants, and how this affects sort of our meat and beef complex going through. So what I thought I'd do is I'd kind of start out throwing some of those things out, and then I've got a few charts that maybe will bring home a couple of those points. With all the packing plant side of things, I thought I'd just start with cattle slaughter. We're now into a bunch of weeks of these plant closings. What I've done here is I've taken our weekly average cattle slaughter and I stuck in an estimate of this week. This week, it looks like we're going to be just over 400,000 head, and I estimated that using USDA's estimated daily slaughter, and I stuck in an estimate for today's slaughter and tomorrow, whatever we run on Saturday. That's a huge decline. In fact, that's pushing, I did some calculation on it, daily slaughter this week of steers and heifers has been estimated to be only 50,000 head per day versus 93,000 the same week a year ago. We go back earlier this year, we were up 97, 98, 99,000 head per day. So we're down a good 40% at least in terms of daily cattle slaughter. And we're going to be down about that for the week as well. So, it's certainly a sharp decline going forward. If I was to show a chart of beef production, the slaughter numbers are mitigated a little bit because our weights are larger. Certainly our fed steer and heifer weights are well above a year ago, some 20 to 30 pounds a head. But still, it puts our beef production down on a weekly basis a good third, it looks like, compared to where we were not long ago before plants started shutting down. To try to put that in a little more perspective too, if you calculate that into like pounds per capita per week, we've gone from about 1.6 pounds per person per week of beef produced down pretty close to about 1.1 or 1 pound per person per week. So a sharp curtailment in slaughter and in beef production. I put together our box beef cutout, the choice box beef cutout. And while this is a weekly average chart, I stuck in for this week, this morning's box beef cutout, which was a record large I wrote it down, $373.85 per hundredweight. So almost $374 per pound in the wholesale market, and you can just see this skyrocketing of prices. I made the comment about restaurants. That's really the environment our restaurants are jumping out into. I had the good fortune to be on a webinar with a couple of my colleagues, Davey Griffin and Jeff Sable, on Wednesday afternoon. They organized a webinar with a bunch of barbecue restaurants. And we had a pretty good discussion about what they're facing in terms of trying to get supplies. It was very common for them to say that they are already being shorted on orders. They're unable to get some of the products that they would normally get, which is related to, if a plant shuts down that happens to produce one particular branded product, then you're going to run out of that particular branded product here in a couple of weeks down the road. And so we're already seeing sharply higher prices for wholesale cuts to restaurants, really tight supplies, and kind of folks getting shorted on their orders, very much so. And it certainly is. I've been asked a lot about shortages, and as an economist, a shortage, well, that's kind of one of those words that is a little hard to talk about, because what exactly does it mean? Well, it might mean that there's less of it out there than you wanted to find. Really, what we're in now is just plain much tighter supplies. And the way a market works is when you got a lot tighter supplies than the demand for the product, that price is going up, and that's exactly what we see. And that high price does two things: it rations demand. It's the signal to buy less of it. It's also the signal to producers to produce more of it. But that's exactly where we're having the problem, is the inability to produce more of it because of the constraint at the packing level. So, I thought it'd be instructive to show where we are this week and continued another week of increase in the box beef cutout. Steer prices, fed steer prices. I did the same thing. I stuck in this what I was seeing this morning for fed cattle prices in the Southern Plains, and it was 94 and change this morning. I've seen some last minute, right before we got on this webinar, I saw some prices quoted at $1 and even up a little higher for some head late today. So when we get a weekly average, it'll be a little higher than this 94 and change that I put in there. But I think it's, hopefully what that's showing is maybe we're seeing some stabilization in prices a little bit as we get to some level of packing plants and runs of packing plants that maybe we're starting to level off with, between closures and reopenings and slower packing schedules. So, I think we'll see a little adjustment in that, but certainly well below a year ago. But hopefully something a little closer to what we averaged last week, which was closer to that $1 than what I stuck in for this week. But I think it gets the general idea of what we've seen so far this week. And I would watch for some late in the day reported prices on fed cattle that are a little better than this. Stuck in a chart, just a 550-pound number one Southern Plains steer calves. We continue to see prices well below a year ago, really affected by our fed cattle prices and futures prices for fed cattle. Excuse me. Because of when those animals might finish if you were purchasing them now. I still think one of the things we're going to see in the next couple of months, it's pretty clear that we got a lot fewer cattle headed to market. People have held on to them, waiting and seeing. Yet that's really going to be, as those come to market, I think particularly in May and June, particularly as it gets hot and dry, we start hitting summer and it starts cutting into our grass supplies a little bit and pasture conditions. I think we're likely to see those animals come to market. Certainly they're coming sooner or later, but our ability to hold them and hold them for many months is probably going to be constrained by the weather coming up. But if we looked at some local auctions, looking around this week, there were some, as I was just kind of scanning them, some higher, some lower, and some depended on, you saw comments in there about local grass conditions and that affecting local prices as well. Let's see, last time I was with y'all a couple of weeks ago, it was a week before the cattle on feed report, and I had my own pre-report estimates. The cattle on feed report came out. We were down about 5% in total cattle on feed. Placements were down about 23%. And while that was a week ago, I did keep this slide in really to point out, as we're backing up animals in the system, we're backing up packing plants, we're backing up feedlots. We certainly see this ripple effect of coronavirus and its effect in our packing sector. We see adjustments happening in cattle on feed. We see adjustments happening out on the ranch as well. And so the rolling effects of this is really starting to show up in some of our data. In cattle on feed, I thought it was worth a chart pointing it out. So I've been asked a bunch of questions about how much beef do we have in cold storage? Does this buffer this reduction in beef production from closing packing plants, slowing packing plants? So shoot, I just at the last minute thought, I just got to ask this question. So about 5 minutes before I got on, I put this chart in just to show how much beef that is. Last month, the report came out, I think, on April 22nd. And so it showed we had about 500 million pounds of beef in cold storage. That's up 11% from a year ago. But it's interesting. I immediately got a call from a reporter said, "Hey, this is a record amount of beef in cold storage." Well, it actually, if by math, it is a record amount of beef in cold storage for March. But storage was up 11%, but it just so happens beef production in March was up 11%. And so a lot of it just plain reflected growing production during that month. I think it's interesting too. Does this provide a lot of buffer or a lot of supplies that can go out to kind of help the price situation? Well, if you look at that 500 million pounds, that's in the ballpark of a week's production of beef in the U.S. So, yeah, it's just a week's worth of beef. It's not a huge amount. In fact, of that 500 million pounds, the overwhelming majority is, for the most part, what I think they term boneless beef in the report, but it's mostly trimmings that are going into ground beef and hamburger production. There's of that 500 million, I think about 35 million pounds of it was muscle cuts, steaks or something like that. That's not very much. And so, what this really does buffer and represents pipeline supplies of trimmings for hamburger, ground beef, but not really a huge amount of supplies sitting out there for steaks and briskets and chucks and everything else, all the other things we might be looking for. So, I think it's interesting. I'm going to be pretty interested in that April report because we've got such a decline in production going on. We'll be hard pressed to add to this. It should go down, I think, in terms of supplies, but I'm not sure it's really fully meaningful in the broader beef market picture. I got about 4 charts I wanted to show you. As we're talking about adjustments, particularly on the slaughter side, I think it's worth recognizing that every one of our meat species is going through the same adjustment. We've got packing plant closures or shutdowns in hogs and chickens. Dairy's a little different situation. We've certainly got slowdowns on lamb as well. And so I thought I'd just take a minute to show some of the adjustments going on in our competing meats. And I thought I'd start with hogs. Again, the same sharp decline in hog slaughter going on that we have in cattle. I'd probably argue they got worse problems on the hog side than we do on the cattle side in terms of plant closings. There's the plant in Sioux Falls that closed and the plant in Minnesota that closed. You take those 2 plants together, those 2 plants are about 12% of daily hog slaughter in the U.S. And then there's been additional closings and slowdowns, and so we see the exact same thing here and getting into some really tight supplies of hogs. That's going to mean tight supplies of bacon, pork butts, ribs, you name it. We're in some pretty tight supplies of those going forward as well. If we were going to look at chickens, it's a little quicker on the chickens, but we certainly see the same adjustment going on in terms of this data. It's the weekly number of chicks placed that we're going to grow out to be broilers. And, on the chicken side, they haven't had necessarily all the plant shutdowns, but they've certainly had slowdowns across the packing sector. So we certainly see them responding very quickly to placing fewer chickens for grow out in the next, 40 to 60 days. They would be hitting a packing plant. So again, all of these effects are rolling through all of our species. I did put lambs in here too. Certainly lambs going to market. If on that market, it's pretty interesting. The effects of coronavirus and restaurant shutdowns forced one packer into bankruptcy, and they didn't have that many packers to begin with. And you certainly see a pretty sharp curtailment in their movement as well. I thought I'd show milk because milk's a little different. It just so happens that all of these turmoil from restaurants rolling on back has hit the dairy industry just as what we would call seasonally what they call a spring flush. Milk production tends to increase sharply in the spring. All this turmoil is hit just as their production hits that peak, this spring flush idea. So they've had a heck of a lot of milk to try to move into all of this going on. And so I think what's in development on the dairy side is some pretty sharp cutting of milk production too, whether changing your milking schedules from 3 times a day to 2 times a day, to culling cows sooner, to drying off cows sooner. We're going to see a whole host of changes going on in trying to pull milk production down as they struggle with disastrously low prices, just like the rest of us are seeing. So that was really my last slide for what's going on this week. Hopefully I hit a couple of good points there that might be useful. I'm going to hit the stop sharing now. I'll take this thing off my screen, maybe if I can. There we go. I'll minimize that, and I think I've quit sharing the screen. And so with that, I'm gonna just kind of open up the chat box and the question and answer box, and we'll start jumping in on these. And so you guys shoot me a question whenever you feel like it. And got a question right off the bat. Where are we on processing plants? Well, I think certainly, I'm going to kind of add on to a couple things I mentioned with the chart, but one is with the executive order. So we have plants in the process of trying to reopen. What that reopening looks like is not exactly clear, because it does in that order require stuff like, taking all the steps you can, following the CDC and other regulations to protect your employees, to get PPE, the personal protective equipment, things like that in the plant. So really, near as I can tell, the plants are in the process of getting open and getting back running. I think it's pretty common across most of our plants to certainly see some slowdowns across everything. But, that slaughter data would suggest this week, we're down 40% from where we were a year ago or before all this mess started. So it's certainly we're in a process of reopening that the path of that is not exactly clear to me. So the next one, I've gotten this question a bunch. The question is Namibia, Africa, 25 tons of chilled meat into our market. So there's several things come to my mind when I think about this. And first, one of them is, what on earth? So when I dig into the statistics, I've seen this, the latest trade statistics I could find was about 50,000 pounds of beef. My understanding is it's supposed to be cooked, already a processed product that is coming here from Namibia, of all places. Why do we import and export? All beef is not the same. So there have been times that we've been the biggest exporter in the world, we being the U.S., and the biggest importer at exactly the same time. And it really goes down to that all beef's not the same. We export some cuts. We export a lot of high-value steaks, high-value products. We also export a lot of low-value stuff or lower-value stuff, chucks. We get to some of the variety meats, liver. I mean, thank goodness somebody wants the liver, because I'm probably not doing my part on the liver and onion consumption. So I'm glad somebody wants that. But, the other thing that strikes me in this is, we talk about trade and we talk about it like it's a country doing it, US, Canada, Mexico, Japan, China. Yet, when it comes to us anyway, trade's done by companies. And one of the things I'd like to know about this is what product is that? What specification of that product is that had a U.S. company buy that product? What was it about that product that made them want to buy that versus somebody else's? If it was a say an already cooked or already processed something for some kind of beef jerky or something, and I'm just throwing that out. What is it about that made that an attractive product in our market, or that a company was sourcing some product there? The other thing I'd say is 50,000 pounds isn't very much in the big picture, yet somebody did find that to be a product they needed for their procurement or supply chain or something. And so it leaves me a lot of questions, because it's not our government buying that from Namibia. It's some company bought that. And so it leaves me with probably more questions than answers, but it's a pretty darn interesting question, I think, and it leads me to stuff about, well, who bought that and what exactly is it? I think is pretty interesting as well. And I'm glad you asked that question, because it's been on a lot of people's minds. Next question: hang on to calves for auction for a while longer for small ranchers? ? So I think that's a great question, and it's a tough one to answer. But this is sort of my thinking on it. I think a lot of people have done the same thing. If we look at the slowdown from placements, slowdown through auction markets, for a lot of a lot of folks have done the same thing. But those calves they're going to come to market from everybody sooner or later. So one of my concerns is, I might, do I have a lot of grass? Are they in good shape? Do I have what I might consider extra grass? Would I be better off saving that grass for the cows and going ahead and moving those calves? Are some of the pasture type things that come to my mind in going into this. But I do think looking forward to calf prices, or what are they going to be in May or June versus now, if we all move them to market in May and June. I think the potential is for some much lower prices, let me be careful saying that. I think the potential is we get a lot of supplies of calves coming to market at the same time down in that May and June time period, particularly as we get towards summer and it gets hot and dry. We know we know pasture conditions can change pretty darn fast. And I think this is a time this year that, if we think about controlling what we can control, we can certainly control our costs. And if we can help it, this is probably not a time we want to be spending a lot of money buying feed. And so, calf prices, quite honestly, probably haven't fallen as far as I might say, quote, they should have given fed cattle prices. And so, I think in regards to that, you probably have a little more time, but I wouldn't want to wait too long, particularly into June, when I think a lot more cattle will be coming to market. And so that's a pretty sorry answer for a good question, or at least me hemming and hawing and dancing around a bunch. But I tend to think you might have a little more time, but not too much time, just because everybody's thinking the exact same thing. Let's see here. I got one over in the chat box. Are most meat processors running 24 hours in a day or 2 shifts? If not, why not? ? Cleaning facility. Well, that's a good question. So we do have plants that normally run double shifts, or if we thought about an 8-hour shift in a day, we might think about 2 shifts running and then a cleaning shift. But because all plants are cleaned because of HACCP regulations, their HACCP plan, and by HACCP I mean Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point plan in their plant and those are food safety regulations. And so there is a cleaning shift in plants. There's cleaning that goes on every day routinely. And so that takes out part of that 24 hours a day. So let's say if you were normally running 2 shifts a day, plus a cleaning shift, there's your 24 hours. So For plants that are still open, I think when we think about are they running full out? Well, my answer is no, but that's because in order to move the employees apart from each other to provide some distance. In a plant, folks are working side by side for their whole shift. If they got a lunch, they're having lunch in their lunchroom, whatever. It's a long period of time to be right next to each other. So plants are trying to spread out to distance, and part of that is operating the plant at a slower speed than they would have 2 months ago. And so, we're not running it in a way at full capacity, but it's a speed issue for practically everybody versus being completely shut down or not. If you wanted to add one of the critical problems on the packing side is if you wanted to add another shift, I got to find some more workers. And we've had some pretty critical labor shortages in packing plants, as we have in lots of agriculture, right? Whether it's fruits and vegetables, dairies, labor availability has been a huge issue. And so even when if you wanted to expand or run some more cattle through, just finding the people to do it's been practically impossible. On the hog side of things, in the last 2.5 years, the hog industry has opened about 4 new plants. And the companies have struggled to run those plants at full capacity, even though we had record number of hogs, because they just couldn't find enough people to work. So in answer to my long-winded answer to your question, cleaning is part of it, but just plain slowing down the speeds in the plant, I think, have been the rest of it. In terms of not running full out. If I could add to that for a minute, we often talk about packer profits, packer margins. If I calculated an estimated margin, as me and a lot of my colleagues would do, we often use as sort of a measure of that. We'll use what's called a live to cut out spread. And what we're doing there is we're calculating the value of the meat coming out of the plant and the drop credit, and subtracting from that the value of the live steer. And we get this margin. That's really a price spread. It's not a profit margin. I think it's a good indicator many times of the direction of profits. The thing it doesn't account for are the costs of slaughtering that animal, the cost of running the line. And so the only cost it takes out is the cost of the live animal. So in that way, it's certainly not a perfect picture of profits. But if I were to calculate that today with a $374 cutout value and a $95 fed cattle price, I'd have a huge margin. I would imply huge packer profits. And, I think that leads to a bunch of questions I've been getting about, well, what does this mean? What is these packer profits? These are record profits. This is what the heck's going on. And, the reason that implied spread is so big is because the plants can't operate like they probably like to. So a plant that's closed is losing money. I think we could all probably say. A plant that is slower than normal is not operating at their lowest cost point, their most efficient point. They're operating at some level that is higher cost per unit. So, in a way, using that measure so much as sort of an indicator really doesn't work very well today in this really extraordinary time, because it doesn't capture that change in costs from running a plant slower, nor does it capture what does it mean, what does it mean if your plant's closed? because clearly you're losing money. You're still paying all the bills, but you got nothing going through. So it's really, this is a time that becomes really an imperfect measure. And I have used that measure for years, and I predict I'll be using it in the future too, because I think it is a useful measure. It's just not perfect. But for direction, I think it's pretty good. And I will say too, if I looked at that measure over the last several years, we would have talked about record large live to cutout spread and some pretty great profits on the packing side of the industry over the last few years as cattle supplies have grown, cattle numbers have grown cyclically. And I think really the last 4 or 5 years of beef demand being the best we've had in probably the last 25 years. And so, I think that measure has its uses, but it's not quite perfect. Gosh, that's the only questions people have typed in so far.
I know.
Clear as mud. Or after a week like this, everyone has abandoned ship and headed for a cold one.
Well, that could be it. Well, Dr. Anderson, and while we're talking, if another one comes in, we can certainly answer that. But appreciate you taking the time to visit with us again today, and just really give us the recap of kind of what's been going on. Sometimes it's not something our members can watch as closely as others can, so it's really good to have your information and then the translation for us as well on kind of what's happening. So we sure appreciate you being here. I still don't see any more come in. So, but again, if y'all have questions, go ahead.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I always enjoy it, and I always enjoy the questions too, even the hard ones, because I think they really get at stuff that's on our minds, and I'm glad to take a shot at answering those things. And so thank you again for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, we were so glad to have you. Another great job. We'll probably see you back again sometime, and then hopefully see you at an in-person event sometime soon.
I'll tell you what, I am really looking forward to in-person.
Us too. We've been talking about not being within striking distance, though. No, I'm kidding. But thank you. And again, we'll send out the recording tomorrow. And if y'all need anything from TSCRA, please do not hesitate to reach out. And we're working for you on your behalf, and certainly want to do whatever we can to help you out. So again, thank you all for being on, and have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks, Stacy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.